So this is going to be our first Blake video going through your revision of what you did in first year. So this first one is going to be the lamb, and what I'm going to try and do is kind of go through all the sort of key components of the AOs. So go through AO1 for your ideas, go through key AO2 for your analysis, which I think is a little bit trickier with this poem because it seems quite simple on the surface. Go through your AO3, so like the key context you need to know as well that you could integrate into your analysis and use to build your points. And also go through your AO5 as well. The AO5 is really, really handy because a lot of the critical stuff actually gives you the ideas for the reading of the poem. So even though the AO5 sometimes can be seen as something that comes later, I think for Blake in a lot of cases it should come first, and it kind of formulates the argument that you're going to create. So I'm hoping now this is going to go onto the other screen, and I will make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see it a little bit better as well. So as you're listening to this video, you'll have your revision booklet as well, so you can go through, make keynotes, so you've got all the different things that sort of correspond to the different AOs, but more importantly just all the different things that you'll need to make sure that you can formulate a convincing, interesting, entertaining argument, because that's essentially what you're doing with literature. You're not just kind of writing to inform, you are writing to persuade, because there's so many different ways that you can read into these poems, and you want to make sure that whoever is reading it is convinced that yours is a brilliant reading. So for this one, you did have some reading for it from first year, and I thought that would be a really good place to start, having a little look back at that. So there's some reading from Mark Brassington, and he talks about there being two states of being, and that's in relation to the lamb and the tiger. So the lamb would be the song of innocence, and the tiger would be the song of experience, and it basically just shows two different ways of interacting with God. So if you were going to use the lamb and the tiger in your big essay, they do go quite nicely together, but they would be two separate paragraphs. But for those of you that were feeling confident, you could make little references to them as you were doing each paragraph, but we don't want to compare and contrast and cross over too much, so they would just be minor references when we were doing it. So if we're looking at the lamb, we can argue that within this poem the lamb is symbolic of Christ, and it very much represents the poem in its entirety, this kind of New Testament ideal of God, showing him as being, kind and benevolent as well. And this just gives us a little bit of a summary. This is from LitCharts actually, and I've put this on because I thought this would be a really good thing to show you, because if there are any poems that Mike and I aren't covering in these videos, if you felt like you just wanted like a quick summary or recap of some of the other ones, LitCharts is really good, so you can sort of use that just to give you a bit of an in into some of the other poems, because we don't really know which one is going to come up as the I question, so that would be quite handy. So it's sort of what we were just talking about really. So the poem sees in the figure of the lamb an expression of God's will, the beauty of God's creation, so all very innocent, very positive. The poem is told from the perspective of a child, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So, granting power onto a child's voice to a degree. And it seems to show this very kind of intuitive, this very natural, this untouched understanding of the nature of joy and the joy of nature, and arguably the joy of God as well. And as we sort of go through the poem, we've got the child expressing wonder at the lamb's existence, and it almost seems on the surface an intuitive understanding of who made the lamb. This idea that they instinctively understand that the lamb is an expression of God's design, because God is good and pure, benevolent, so any of his creations would be as well. But the reading I'm going to show in a moment sort of disagrees with that, because this is a lovely reading, but perhaps it's a little bit too nice, so perhaps it's a little bit too basic as well. So we're going to look at a bit of a darker reading of it as well. This is where it becomes a little bit darker. I don't know if I can move this actually. There we go. So this is your AO3, this is your context. So if you were going to write about the lamb in the exam, you'd have to be able to talk about catechistic learning, which is really common of the period, And it was really common for children to learn through catechism, so learning through questions and answers, and essentially memorization. They'd learn the questions, learn the answers, and kind of answer their own questions with what they've been taught. And they were frequently found in 18th century children's literature. And Blake, in his usual manner, is questioning this practice, and he's very much challenging it as well. And as we know, children's literature, still now to a degree, but definitely within the time in which Blake was writing, and also moving through into like the Victorian, Edwardian period, it was very much seen as having a didactic purpose, children's literature, children's writing, and it was very much instructing children on how to behave and how to think and how to feel. So it was very much there to form the person into what society expected them to be. So in terms of your wider reading, like I talked about before, this is really, really handy. So this is some of your wider kind of reading, which again you may well have had a little look at in first year, but if you haven't seen this exact one, you will have done something else in its place. But if you like any of this, you could use it as well or instead of. So this would be a crit. So you can quote Smith, and that will quote sort of count as your AO5. So you could use this to kind of begin your arguments, weave into your analysis, to evaluate, and you can also just kind of use some of the ideas as your own as well. One of the biggest things that I notice when I examine is expression. So people using quite academic vocabulary. So that would be another thing I'd be adding into your revision resources. Make sure that you've got some nice language in there so we can kind of elevate all those AOs. So in Smith's, they talk about catechism, so as a method of exposing more of the impressionable and illiterate to scriptural and theological doctrines. And again, it's that word expose, which is quite negative, isn't it? This idea that people are being exposed perhaps against their will to particular lessons, doctrines, ideologies. And impressionable, arguably relates to children in their innocent form. So the catechisms and liturgy and the prayer book functioned in performative and interpretive ways to instill, but you could use inculcate instead. So to inculcate the behaviours and beliefs desired by the church. So even though on the surface, you look at this poem and think, oh, it's really nice. It's about a lamb and who made the lamb, who made Christ, and the sort of the beauty and benevolence of Christ and God. On kind of a darker level, is it a child learning a particular response to God? And is it a child ingesting sort of particular religious doctrine that they then are instilling or bestowing onto others? And thus, like, quite a dangerous cycle ensues. So that would be quite an interesting one to talk about as well. The lamb and the tiger both kind of do the same thing, which Smith talks about as well. They directly address the question of creators and artists and the nature of God himself as well. And Richardson concurs. We have a sort of critic within a critic here, so you can just use Richardson on their own. Concurs that Blake's The Lamb also portrays a scene of thwarted instruction, but in this case it's a child who plays catechist with a lamb as his unresponsive though docile enough pupil. So this is quite interesting because Blake, we know that he's someone who very much is a great lover and very much appreciative of the innocence of children, untouched by the corruption of the adult world. Is he bestowing kind of that power and independence onto the child by having them play catechist? Or is this showing very much that the child has become corrupted themselves by the catechistic learning and is now bestowing it onto others? So you can kind of read it in two different ways here. Is it them having a voice and a voice bestowed onto them, the voice of innocence, which is one which should be kind of heard, that should be listened to, that should be appreciated, or is it that they themselves have had their actual voice taken away and it's been replaced by the catechistic learning instead? So that's kind of what's happening here then. So if you have a little look at this slide, It says that the lamb appears to conform without too much variation to the standard rhetoric of children's literature in the 18th century, which it very much does. It's very much, question, answer. It's quite memorable as well. And you have the child kind of dictating the catechism to his animal pupil. Again, the traditional form of question and answer. And we see here very much an internalisation of Christian and cultural norms. So the dictating of ideologies that has been almost kind of swallowed by the child and then regurgitated in the same form. But the bit that's quite interesting here is some critics kind of see a divergence. This is quite nice. I've tried to highlight the bits that I think are interesting. A divergence from actual catechistic form, notably in the child's role as a catechizer to the lamb. So Blake's kind of placing the child in a more authoritative position than in other typical children's books of the period. So this could be Blake, to a degree, subverting the traditional hierarchy in children's books where we normally have kind of adults of authority figures. But here we have children kind of holding this kind of powerful authoritative voice, and they are the ones who are explaining from their own kind of standpoint, their viewpoint, their own position. And as we know, it is a song of innocence, so it's from a place of innocence that they are giving their views. But if we're going to make it more cynical, ultimately, even though the child is being given a voice, that voice is kind of just parroting the same things. So the same kind of hierarchical precepts that have already been sort of received. So the whole kind of catechistic system becomes really cyclical, doesn't it? Even though perhaps we can read it in a positive way, like, oh, the child has a voice, like, I'll tell thee, he is called by thy name. Ultimately, are they just not mirroring and regurgitating and parroting what they've already been told? So even though there is this kind of faint trace of subversion, ultimately that child's voice and their innocence is being corrupted by this educational system. So any hope for these kind of new voices, these pure voices coming through in society, they're very much being kind of thwarted and subdued and silenced by this form of learning, which is removing childhood innocence and real childhood voice and perspective as well. So what I've done to help you is, because obviously with all these poems, we're only going to be able to write a paragraph about them, and you'll have to do it 3 times about 3 different ones. So I've given you a question up here. So the power of Blake's poetry is to make the reader see the world afresh. How far do you agree with this view? So this is how I would write about it if this was my paragraph. So as you're reading through this, I've been making a note of key phrases, key words, key ideas, and to a degree with Blake, you can almost learn what the paragraph is going to be, and then you can just sort of twist it to the question, which you'll be really good at because you've done it all this year as well. So Blake's Song of Innocence, Lamb, arguably seeks to make the reader see the world afresh by provoking them to reflect upon the orthodoxy of moral didactism through the use of the catechistic structures that were at the heart of 18th century children's education, religion and literature. So in our point, we've already kind of engaged with the question, and we've already kind of brought in a lot of context too, which is really, really good. And then it says, on the surface, the lamb appears to conform to the traditional catechistic formula prevalent in 18th century children's literature that made children thoughtless vessels who merely parroted learned questions and answers. The opening line continues the emphasis upon aesthetic production as it raises the question of creators and creation, little lamb who may be. The initial stanza continues to employ a pattern of pastoral imagery, a common trope of romantic poetry. We want to do this as much as we can, really talk about characteristics. And that creates this very much like New Testament image of God, and they build that image through references to like the tender voices they create and how the veils rejoice in this image as well. However, Richardson concurs, so I'm bringing in my crit now. Blake's The Lamb also portrays a scene of thwarted instruction, as it is the child who plays catechist with a lamb as his unresponsive though docile enough pupil. This is alluded to at the second stanza, when Blake employs the use of anaphora when he says, "I'll tell thee," within the couplet. This positions a child as a now teacher of catechisms and grants them a more authoritative position than typical children's books allow. So you can kind of see I keep weaving in the context, creating, I quite like this bit, so I've just kept it in bold, a subversion of the traditional hierarchy in children's books that positioned adults as authority figures. Blake arguably grants power and strength to a previously quieted voice to indicate his love and sympathy for the innocent perfection of childhood that exists before the corruption of experience, a common trope within his poetry. But, and this is how we're kind of building it and making it a bit more complicated, but from a more cynical perspective, it could be said that the child is parroting the same hierarchical precepts that it had previously received. Therefore, and we always want to do this at the end of our paragraphs for Blake before we move on, we've got to sort of bring it all together. Therefore, although he may be granting power to the children subjected to catechistic learning, urging the reader to see the world afresh. So I've gone back to my question. I perhaps could have done that a bit more in the paragraph if I was going to improve it further. To see the world afresh by appreciating the beauty and purity of a child's voice. And though he ultimately suggests that their innocence and freedom will be corrupted by the outside world. So he's kind of shown his hope for the role that children could have and their views, their voice could have on the world and the impression it could have and the influence it could have. He's kind of ultimately accepting that because of the state of the world and the corruptive influence of our world, that probably isn't going to happen. And that would be a really, really nice way of approaching it. So that would be a really good thing to go away and do now. So looking at that question, seeing the world afresh, which other poems could you use? You will have another poem to watch this week for the tiger, so that would be another good choice for the question. But are there any other poems that you feel really confident with from first year, or you think actually that would be a really, really nice one for this too? And the other thing you could do is, for the lamb and the tiger videos that you're watching this week, can you start to think about, well, how can I kind of twist that a little bit and make it work for a different exam question? So hopefully that's been helpful. You've got your ideas, you've got your analysis, you've got your context, you've got your crit, and you've got a structure for a paragraph that you could use for the poem as well. But obviously, if there's anything different that you have that you think is really good as well, that isn't to say that you can't use that. These are just ideas for what you could use, and a nice way of kind of bringing everything together too. And this is just me trying to figure out now how to get back to the screen to stop what I'm doing.